My name is Paige Sullivan. I was 38 years old the day a sheriff's deputy knocked on my apartment door and asked a question that shattered everything I believed about my family. Ms. Sullivan? Yes. Did you know your parents passed away 3 days ago? I stared at him, unable to utter a single word. What? I'm very sorry for your loss. No, that's impossible. He lowered his eyes. There was a house fire. My knees nearly gave out. There has to be a mistake. I'm afraid there isn't. I couldn't hear anything after that. The world became strangely quiet. 3 days. My parents had been dead for 3 days. And no one had told me. Not a phone call. Not a text. Not even a short email. I stood frozen in the doorway while the deputy carefully handed me a small envelope. It was found among your parents' important documents. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single business card from a law office in Asheville, North Carolina. Written on the back, in my mother's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 words: "Find the truth before believing anyone." I read them again. Then again. Nothing else. No explanation. No goodbye. Just 6 words. Before I could ask another question, my phone vibrated. An unknown number. I answered immediately. Hello? For several seconds, there was only silence on the line. Then a woman's calm voice finally broke the silence. So they actually contacted you. Who is this? I wondered whether your mother would find a way. What are you talking about? You should leave town. What? If you come back for the funeral, she paused. Don't trust anyone with the last name Sullivan. The call disconnected. I tried calling back, but a recording stated that the number no longer existed. I looked down at the business card in my hand. Then back at the deputy. Something felt terribly, irreparably wrong. My parents had always called me every Sunday. Every single Sunday. If they had died 3 days ago, why hadn't anyone in my family told me? And why would my own mother leave behind a message telling me not to believe them? Before I tell you what I discovered after returning to the town I once called home, tell me where you're watching from today. It amazed me how stories can travel across the world, even when the people inside them spent years trapped in silence. Now let's go back, because none of this actually began with the fire. It began almost 14 years earlier. Back when I still believed my family told each other the truth. I grew up in the small mountain town of Blackwood, North Carolina. Everyone knew everyone. People rarely locked their front doors, and Friday night football games felt more important than presidential elections. My father, Daniel Sullivan, owned the oldest hardware store in town. My mother, Rebecca Sullivan, worked as a librarian at the county library. Neither of them cared about becoming rich. They believed a peaceful life was worth far more than a successful career. And I believed them. I was the oldest child. My brother Tyler was 4 years younger than me. We weren't perfect siblings. We argued over the remote, bedrooms, and whose turn it was to wash the dishes. But whenever someone tried to pick on him at school, that person had to answer to me. That's simply how families worked. Or at least, that's how I thought families worked. There was one more person who practically lived in our house. My father's younger cousin, Victor Sullivan. Formally, he wasn't my uncle, but everyone called him Uncle Victor anyway. He was charming, funny, and incredibly successful. He owned several construction companies across western North Carolina. Whenever he visited, people naturally gathered around him. He remembered birthdays, brought expensive presents, and donated money to local charities. Adults admired him. Children adored him. Looking back, I realize I never once saw him lose his temper. Some people mistake rigid self-control for kindness, but they are far from the same thing. When I graduated from high school, I received a scholarship to study investigative journalism in Chicago. It was everything I had dreamed about. I wanted to expose corruption, tell stories that mattered, and give ordinary people a voice. My father hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe, saying, "You'll always have a home here." Mom cried through most of the celebratory dinner. Tyler pretended he wasn't going to miss me, and Victor smiled wider than anyone. You were never meant for a small town. At the time, it sounded like encouragement. Years later, I realized it was a look of relief. College was difficult, vibrant, and terrifying. Exactly what growing up should feel like. Every Sunday evening, my parents called me. Every single birthday, they drove 10 hours just to take me out for dinner. Every Christmas, I returned home, until that one particular summer during my senior year. Everything changed so quietly that I almost missed it. My father sounded distracted during our calls. Mom seemed anxious. Tyler barely spoke during dinner when I came home for a weekend visit. Victor, on the other hand, started showing up constantly. Breakfast, lunch, late-night coffee, endless business meetings with my father, church on Sundays. It was as though he had slowly become part of every decision my parents made. When I asked my father why this was happening, he smiled. "Victor's helping us with some investments." Mom never smiled when he said that. She simply looked down at her coffee cup. I wish I had paid more attention, because sometimes the quietest person in the room already knows the storm is coming. And my mother had been afraid for much longer than I realized. During my final year of college, I interned for a newspaper that specialized in financial investigations. Most interns covered school board meetings and town festivals, but I somehow kept ending up with stories about missing money. The editor joked that I had a talent for noticing details everyone else ignored. I laughed. I had no idea that talent would one day expose my own family. After graduation, I accepted a job offer in Chicago. The salary was modest, but it was enough to rent a small apartment and begin building the career I had dreamed of. My parents couldn't have been prouder. My father framed my first article and hung it behind the cash register at the store. Mom clipped every piece I wrote and kept them inside a scrapbook. Whenever I called, she would say, "We're proud of you, Paige." I never got tired of hearing it. About 3 years after my graduation, my father surprised me. During a phone call, he said, "I'm thinking about retiring." I was shocked. "You?" He laughed. "I'm getting older. You've been saying that since you turned 50. This time, I mean it." "So who's taking over the store?" There was a long pause. "I'm not sure yet," he replied quietly. I expected him to say Tyler. Instead, he quickly changed the subject. At the time, I didn't think much about it. Now I know that conversation mattered more than either of us realized. Over the following year, the atmosphere at home began to change rapidly. My father stopped talking about retirement. Mom sounded more anxious every time we spoke. Sometimes she would suddenly lower her voice in the middle of a sentence, then just as quickly begin speaking with forced cheerfulness, as if someone had just entered the room. One evening I asked her directly, "Is everything okay?" "Of course. You sound strange." "I'm just tired." "You've never been a good liar, Mom." She laughed softly. "I suppose mothers never stop worrying needlessly." "About what?" "About you." "I'm fine." "I know." Another pause. "Just promise me something." "Anything." "If anything ever feels wrong," she hesitated. "Trust what you see yourself, not what people tell you." I smiled. "That's very mysterious." "Maybe." And she changed the subject. At the time, I chalked it up to her being overly emotional. Looking back, I understand. She was desperately trying to tell me something. But she wasn't sure it was safe. Around that same time, Tyler accepted a management position at my father's store. Everyone in town congratulated him. It seemed like the perfect plan. A family business staying in the family. Victor celebrated louder than anyone. He organized a lavish dinner at the nicest restaurant in town and gave a long toast about legacy, loyalty, and keeping the Sullivan name respected. Everyone applauded. Except Mom. She barely touched her food. A few months later, I returned home for Thanksgiving. The atmosphere felt different. Not bad, just heavy. My father had become unusually quiet. Tyler checked his phone constantly, and Victor answered questions before anyone else had a chance to speak. Even the simplest ones. "What color should we paint the porch?" Victor answered. "When should we replace the work truck?" Victor answered. "Should we expand the garden next spring?" Again, Victor answered. It was subtle, but impossible to ignore once I noticed it. At one point, my father started explaining something about their suppliers, but Victor interrupted him mid-sentence. And my father immediately stopped talking. That wasn't like my dad at all. Later that evening, I found Mom alone by the sink. "Are you okay?" She smiled. "I'm fine." "You've said that 4 times today." "I know. Something's going on." She looked back toward the dining room door before answering. Have you ever noticed how some people help so much that eventually nobody remembers how to make decisions without them? I frowned. What does that mean? She quickly forced another smile. It doesn't mean anything. Just silly thoughts. Mom, it clearly means something. She dried her hands with a towel. Promise me you'll come back for Christmas. I already planned to, no matter what happens. I laughed. What could possibly happen before Christmas? She looked at me for several long seconds. I hope nothing. Those were the last honest words my mother ever spoke to me in private, without someone else listening. December arrived. Work consumed me. A major corruption investigation kept me in the newsroom for days on end. I called home constantly. Sometimes Mom answered, sometimes Tyler, but increasingly, it was Victor. It began to seem almost normal. Your parents are busy, they're resting, they stepped outside, they'll call you later. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. Whenever Mom finally managed to speak to me, she sounded rushed. Like someone was standing right over her shoulder. And then something happened that should have alarmed me, but instead just left me confused. On January 14th, my mother missed my birthday for the first time in my life. She had never forgotten. Not when I was in college, not when she was hospitalized with pneumonia, not even during a hurricane that knocked out power across the entire county. Every birthday began with Mom calling before 9 in the morning. That day, there was only silence. At noon, I called myself. Victor answered. Happy birthday, Paige. Where's Mom? She's sleeping. At noon, she hasn't been feeling well. Can I talk to Dad? He's out. When will they be able to call me? I'm sure later this evening. Neither of them ever called. Mom finally called me the next day. She apologized endlessly, claiming she had mixed up the dates due to a migraine. My mother, the woman who remembered the birthdays of students she had taught 15 years ago, supposedly forgot her own daughter's birthday. I convinced myself that everyone makes mistakes. Today, I know the truth. She simply wasn't allowed to make that call. Over the following months, the oddities multiplied. My father stopped replying to emails. Holiday cards arrived without his signature. Family photographs disappeared from the house. Whenever I asked for a video call, they always had an excuse. Poor internet, a broken camera, bad timing. The excuses were always believable. Just believable enough for me to trust them. Eventually, I stopped asking questions. Life got busy with promotions, deadlines, and business trips. I internalized the bitter thought that families naturally drift apart as children grow up. I was entirely wrong. Families don't fall apart on their own in a single day. Sometimes, someone deliberately and quietly separates them, conversation by conversation, week by week. And while I was building the career I had always wanted, someone back home was crafting a completely different story about me. A story I didn't even know existed. One that would ultimately convince the people I loved most that I was the one who had abandoned them and wiped them from my life. After that terrifying visit from the deputy and the strange phone call, I dropped everything and rushed back to Blackwood. The truth didn't come out all at once, but when it did, it unfolded into a trial that lasted 6 days. Not because the truth was complicated, but because the lies had been repeated for so many years that everyone involved had come to believe them as gospel. Victor showed up to court every morning wearing a flawless suit and the same confident smile that had once convinced the entire town he was the ultimate protector of the Sullivan family. Tyler sat right next to him. He wouldn't even look in my direction. For nearly 14 years, my brother had truly believed I broke off all contact with Mom and Dad because a big city career mattered more to me than my loved ones. This was the myth Victor had painstakingly built since my graduation. And now, that myth was collapsing before everyone's eyes. The turning point came from someone nobody expected, our old family attorney, Harold Jensen. He had retired about 8 years ago, but when investigators tracked him down, he agreed to testify. He walked slowly into the courtroom, carrying 3 old archival storage boxes that hadn't been opened in years. Inside were the original copies of my parents' wills, old business agreements, bank statements, and dozens of handwritten notes from my mother. At the sight of those boxes, Victor looked nervous for the very first time. Harold adjusted his glasses and, looking at the judge, said, "Daniel and Rebecca Sullivan never intended to exclude Paige from their lives." A dead silence fell over the courtroom. They were firmly convinced that Paige herself was rejecting every attempt they made to contact her. He opened the first box and pulled out a thick stack of letters. I know this because I personally helped mail some of them. He displayed the envelopes. Every single one had been returned with stamps reading, moved, left no address, incorrect address, or recipient unknown. The problem was, my address in Chicago had never changed. Investigators later proved exactly how Victor operated. He convinced my parents that I had demanded a total severance of ties. To cement this deception, he secretly intercepted almost every letter they tried to send me and blocked my counterattempts to reach them. He rerouted mail through a vacant office building owned by one of his construction companies. My parents' phone numbers were quietly altered in provider databases under the guise of spam protection. Emails were filtered through software, holiday invitations disappeared, and my birthday gifts were simply thrown away. For nearly 14 years, both sides lived in the absolute certainty that the other had chosen a cruel silence. Victor hadn't just lied. He had built an invisible wall between us. Brick by brick, conversation by conversation. Year after year, then the prosecution moved to the financial records. The whole town believed Victor had saved my father's hardware store from bankruptcy. The reality was exactly the opposite. Victor had methodically bought up shares of the business through podstavные shell companies, convincing my father he was signing standard documents for temporary refinancing and collateral for working capital. In reality, those papers legally transferred ownership. First of the store, then of the family home, then of extensive plots of land outside town. Everything was executed perfectly from a legal standpoint, because my father's signatures were genuine, but they were obtained through total deception. My dad didn't realize until the final moments that he no longer owned the business he had given 40 years of his life to. By the time he suspected something, practically all the property already belonged to Victor. Mom discovered this fraudulent scheme just a few months before the fire. That was why she left me that note on the back of the lawyer's card. She knew no one else in town would dig into the background of a respected benefactor. The investigation into the cause of the fire lasted nearly a year. In the end, experts reached a painful conclusion. The fire itself was an accident, a short circuit in old wiring in the attic. But what investigators uncovered changed the nature of the case. Victor knew beyond a doubt that the wiring in the house was in dangerous condition. An official inspector's report had warned him about it 18 months before the tragedy, as Victor managed all property matters for my parents through a power of attorney. Instead of allocating funds for repairs, he ignored the directive. Replacing the wiring would have triggered official inspections, which would have delayed the transfer of large insurance policies and business assets he was finalizing. His inaction didn't start the fire directly, but it guaranteed that a tragedy would happen. And that criminal negligence formed the basis of the final charge. The verdict came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Fraud, wire fraud, forgery, mail tampering, financial exploitation of the elderly, obstruction of justice, and involuntary manslaughter due to criminal negligence. The judge spoke for nearly 40 minutes before announcing the sentences. Victor Sullivan was sentenced to a lengthy term in a maximum security federal prison. All assets connected to his firms were seized. My father's store was returned to the estate. The family home and land were restored. Millions of dollars in fraudulent transactions were annulled by the court. When the hearing adjourned, Victor finally turned and looked at me. Not with rage, not with remorse. With absolute bewilderment, as if he couldn't grasp why his perfect script had suddenly stopped working. I didn't say a single word. Some victories don't require commentary. Tyler caught up with me on the courthouse steps. For a few seconds, we just stood in the rain in silence. Then he handed me a package wrapped in heavy brown paper. "I found this in Mom's closet, in the very back corner," he said quietly. Inside was the small wooden memory box Mom had given me before I left for college, the one I thought I had lost somewhere. It was stuffed to the brim with letters. Dozens of letters. Mom had written them to me over the course of all those 14 years. For every one of my birthdays. For every Christmas. For every milestone I might have achieved or disappointment she thought I might be facing far away from them. Not a single one of these letters was ever sent. Victor always found excuses to collect the mail himself, so she eventually began hiding them when she started to suspect something. I couldn't stop crying. Tyler was crying with me. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, throwing his arms around me. I believed him. All these years, I was angry at you. I shook my head. Dad believed him. Mom believed him. The whole town believed him. Victor stole our trust first, Tyler. Stealing everything else after that was just a technicality. My brother hugged me tighter than he ever had as a child. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, we were a family again. A year later, Tyler and I reopened Sullivan Hardware. Not because either of us needed the business, but because it was our father's life's work. We kept the old wooden floors, the squeaky front door, and the faded sign that Dad had once stubbornly refused to replace. Customers returned gradually. Many came up to apologize for believing the rumors about me. I didn't blame anyone. They only knew the story they were skillfully fed. Sometimes good people become part of someone else's lie without ever realizing it. I left investigative journalism, not because I stopped loving investigations, but because I had lived through one myself. Instead, I founded a non-profit organization that helps families facing financial exploitation and fraud committed by relatives. Every month, I see people whose lives were destroyed not by traveling bandits, but by loved ones they trusted completely. The worst betrayal is rarely loud. Most often, it's the person softly smiling in your face while their hand rewrites your destiny. Tyler eventually married. I stood beside him at the ceremony as his best woman. Before heading to the altar, he handed me one last envelope. Mom had written it just a couple of weeks before that fateful night. Across the front, her handwriting read, "To be opened when my family is together again." Inside were just 2 sentences. The truth may be delayed along the way, but it always remembers the path home. And when it arrives, do not waste your life hating those who believed the lie. Save your strength to simply live the life we wanted for you. That letter still sits in my desk drawer. And every time I feel like the world is unfair, I reread those lines. People often ask me if I hate Victor. My answer surprises them. No, hate would mean he still occupies a space in my soul and in my life. And he doesn't. But what I truly mourn are the 14 years my parents and I lost. Birthdays, Christmas mornings, Sunday dinners, silly everyday conversations that we will never have again. No court can return that time. No prison sentence can compensate for those years. But the truth gave me something just as valuable. It gave me my name back. For too long, the people of this county viewed me as the daughter who ran away and forgot her roots. Now they know that all those years, I was just trying to find my way home through a thick wall of someone else's lies. If this story reminded you of someone or something in your own life, remember this: real, deep manipulation never begins with arguments or shouting. It begins with the gentle control of information. One intercepted letter. One unanswered call. One conversation whose substance a third party carefully distorted in someone else's ears. Protect your connections with your loved ones. Ask questions directly. Verify what you are told. And never, under any circumstances, allow a single person to become the only bridge between you and those you love. If this story resonated with you, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what detail touched you the most. Subscribe to the Family Secrets Daily channel so you don't miss new real-life dramas. Thank you for spending this time with me. Remember, all characters and events in this story are a work of fiction created for reflection. But let it serve as a reminder that justice is not about revenge. It is about bringing back the truth, restoring what was broken, and refusing to let someone else's lies define who you truly are.